The Winter War Archive. A sleep journey through Finland's frozen conflicts settle into stillness now, letting the weight of the day dissolve as we enter the archive together. Picture yourself in a quiet room lined with wooden shelves, the smell of old paper and leather filling the air. Outside, snow falls in thick silence. Here, among forgotten documents and weathered photographs, we'll trace the story of a war where winter itself became a combatant, where temperatures reached 40 degrees below zero, and where an entire nation held its breath through the darkest months of 1930. In the freezing November of 1939, in the deep forests of Finland, a dark period began in which not only armies but also nature itself became a part of the war. This book recounts that time with the meticulousness of an archivist, focusing on the physical and psychological devastation caused by temperatures as low as many 40 degrees Celsius. 2 dusty documents, technical drawings, and forgotten diaries. The Gathering Storm. Europe on the precipice. The autumn of 1939 carried a peculiar heaviness across Europe, a sense that the world was tipping inexorably toward catastrophe. In cafes from Paris to Warsaw, people spoke in hushed tones about the future, while governments shuffled papers and armies mobilized with the grim efficiency of machinery long prepared. The German invasion of Poland on the 1st of September had shattered what remained of the fragile peace, and within days, Britain and France had declared war on Nazi Germany. Yet this was merely the opening act of a much larger tragedy. In Moscow, inside the imposing walls of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin surveyed the changing landscape of European power with the calculating eye of a chess grandmaster. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed just weeks before the invasion of Poland, had included secret protocols that few outside the highest circles of Soviet and German leadership knew existed. These protocols carved Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, and Finland, that small Nordic nation of fewer than 4 million souls, found itself assigned to the Soviet domain like a piece on a board, its autonomy subject to the whims of larger powers. The roots of Soviet anxiety regarding Finland ran deep into history and geography. Leningrad, formerly known as St. Petersburg and the jewel of Imperial Russia, sat a mere 32 kilometers from the Finnish border along the Karelian Isthmus. This proximity gnawed at Soviet strategic planners. In their calculations, Finland represented both a potential staging ground for attacks against the Soviet Union and a vulnerability that could not be tolerated in an increasingly hostile world. The Soviet leadership feared that Nazi Germany, despite the recent non-aggression pact, might eventually use Finnish territory as a launching point for an invasion, much as armies had done throughout Russia's bloodied history. Throughout October and early November, Soviet diplomats had pressed Finland with increasingly insistent demands. They wanted the border moved back by 25 kilometers on the Karelian Isthmus to create a protective buffer around Leningrad. They demanded the lease of the Hanko Peninsula for 30 years to establish a Soviet naval base. They sought control of several islands in the Gulf of Finland. In exchange, they offered a larger tract of Soviet territory in eastern Karelia, land that held little strategic or economic value to Finland. The Finnish government, led by President Kyösti Kallio and guided by the Council of Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, viewed these demands with profound suspicion. The Finnish people had won their independence from Russia only 22 years earlier, in the chaos following the Bolshevik Revolution. That independence had been paid for in blood during a brutal civil war that pitted red Finns against white Finns, leaving scars that still marked Finnish society. The memory of Russian domination remained fresh, and with it came a deep wariness of Soviet intentions. Finnish negotiators understood the geopolitical reality of their situation. They were willing to make some concessions, to cede some territory in exchange for peace, but the Soviet demands struck at the heart of Finnish sovereignty. The Mannerheim Line, the defensive fortifications laboriously constructed along the Karelian Isthmus, represented Finland's first line of defense. To move the border back would mean abandoning these fortifications and leaving the nation vulnerable. Moreover, Finnish leaders suspected, correctly, that any territorial concession might simply be a prelude to further demands. A slow-motion annexation disguised as negotiation. The diplomatic dance between Helsinki and Moscow grew increasingly tense through November. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov adopted an inflexible stance, presenting the Soviet demands as minimal requirements for mutual security rather than opening positions in a negotiation. The Finns, meanwhile, believed they were negotiating in good faith, attempting to find middle ground. This fundamental misunderstanding doomed the talks. Stalin had little patience for protracted negotiation and even less tolerance for what he perceived as Finnish intransigence. In his view, the security of Leningrad was non-negotiable, and Finland's reluctance to comply suggested either foolishness or hidden hostility. On the 26th of November, near the village of Mainilai on the Soviet side of the border, an incident occurred that would provide the pretext for war. Soviet artillery positions reported coming under fire from Finnish territory, with casualties claimed among Soviet troops. The Soviet government immediately lodged a formal protest, accusing Finland of aggression and demanding that Finnish troops be pulled back from the border. The Finnish government, bewildered by these accusations, denied any involvement and offered to conduct a joint investigation. International observers would later conclude that the Manila incident was almost certainly staged by the Soviets themselves, a false flag operation designed to justify the coming invasion. Stalin had already made his decision. Soviet military planners had drawn up elaborate schemes for the conquest of Finland, operations that commanders assured the Soviet leadership would be completed swiftly, perhaps in time to celebrate Stalin's 60th birthday on the 21st of December. Composer Dmitri Shostakovich had even been commissioned to write a suite on Finnish themes, celebratory music intended for the victorious Red Army's parade through the streets of Helsinki. The Soviet High Command, recently purged of experienced officers during Stalin's Great Terror, approached the Finnish campaign with dangerous overconfidence. On the 28th of November, the Soviet Union renounced its non-aggression pact with Finland and severed diplomatic relations. The die was cast. In Helsinki, air raid sirens were tested, and civilians began digging trenches in parks and public squares. The Finnish military, which had been conducting quiet mobilizations under the guise of training exercises, moved to full readiness. Families stockpiled food and candles. In churches across the land, prayers were offered for deliverance from the storm that everyone could now see approaching. The Finnish people faced this crisis with a particular quality of spirit that defies easy translation. The word sisu captures something essential about Finnish character, a combination of stoic determination, stubborn courage, and refusal to surrender even when circumstances appear hopeless. It was this quality, forged through centuries of survival in a harsh climate and shaped by the experience of independence hard-won, that would define Finland's response to the coming onslaught. The land and its people, Finland's geography, culture, and character. To understand the Winter War, one must first understand Finland itself, for the land shaped the conflict as profoundly as any military strategy. Finland in 1939 was a nation of deep forests and countless lakes, a landscape that seemed designed by nature to challenge human ambition. Nearly two-thirds of the country lay under dense woodland, primarily spruce and pine, trees that grew thick and close together, creating a canopy that blocked out light and muffled sound. These forests were not the tame, managed woodlands of Western Europe, but true wilderness, places where a person could wander for days without encountering another human soul. The Finnish landscape was cross-hatched with waterways, from massive lakes like Saimaa to thousands of smaller bodies of water connected by rivers and streams. In winter, these lakes froze solid, their surfaces becoming highways for skiers and sleds. The terrain rolled and undulated, not with dramatic mountains, but with countless hills and ridges that provided natural defensive positions. Swamps and bogs, frozen hard in winter, but treacherous in warmer months, filled the low-lying areas. Roads were few and mostly unpaved, single-lane tracks that wound through the forests following the paths of least resistance. The winter climate of Finland tested human endurance in ways that outsiders often fail to comprehend until they experienced it firsthand. The winter of 1938 to 1940 would prove exceptionally severe, one of the coldest on record. Temperatures plunged to -43 degrees Celsius on the Karelian Isthmus and even lower in the northern reaches. At these temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Breath crystallizes in the air. Metal becomes dangerous to touch with bare hands. The days shortened until there were only a few hours of weak, grey light, and the nights stretched on in darkness that seemed to have weight and substance. Finnish society, in 1933, reflected the character of the land. The population of roughly 3.7 million was spread thinly across a territory the size of Germany. Most Finns lived in small towns and villages, communities bound together by necessity and tradition. Agriculture and forestry formed the backbone of the economy, though industrialization had made significant strides since independence. The Finnish people were by nature reserved and practical, suspicious of grand rhetoric, but deeply committed to concepts of duty and community. The memory of the Civil War still cast shadows across Finnish society. The White Forces, supported by Germany and led by Mannerheim, had ultimately triumphed over the Communist Red Forces backed by Soviet Russia. But victory had come at tremendous cost, with tens of thousands dead and the nation divided by bitter ideological rifts. The White Terror that followed the war's end in 1918 had seen thousands of Red Finns executed or imprisoned. 20 years later, these wounds had not fully healed, though the threat from the Soviet Union had a way of unifying disparate factions. Field Marshal Mannerheim embodied many of Finland's contradictions. Born into a Swedish-speaking aristocratic family, he had served as a cavalry officer in the Russian Imperial Army for 3 decades before returning to Finland to lead the White Forces in the Civil War. He spoke better Swedish and Russian than Finnish, yet he commanded the respect and loyalty of Finnish soldiers from all backgrounds. His military experience was vast, but he also understood Finland's limitations. He knew that in any direct confrontation with the Soviet Union, Finland would be hopelessly outmatched in terms of numbers and equipment. This realistic assessment had driven Finnish military planning throughout the 1930s. The Mannerheim Line, stretching across the Karelian Isthmus, represented Finland's attempt to compensate for numerical inferiority with defensive preparation. The line consisted of concrete bunkers, artillery positions, anti-tank obstacles and interconnected trenches, all taking advantage of the natural terrain of lakes, forests and rocky hills. It was not comparable to France's famous Maginot Line in terms of scale or sophistication, but it reflected careful planning and hard work. Finnish military doctrine emphasized mobility, individual initiative, and intimate knowledge of terrain. Finnish soldiers were trained as hunters and scouts as much as conventional infantry. Most had grown up skiing, and for them, traversing snow-covered forests on skis was as natural as walking. They understood how to survive in extreme cold, how to move silently through woods, how to read the landscape for tactical advantage. These skills, ingrained from childhood, would prove invaluable in the coming conflict. The Finnish armed forces numbered about 300,000 after full mobilization, drawn from a population that had universal male conscription. This was a citizen army in the truest sense. Farmers and factory workers and teachers transformed into soldiers. They were poorly equipped by the standards of major European powers. Finland possessed only 32 tanks, obsolete models purchased from Britain and France. The Air Force had fewer than 115 aircraft, many of them outdated. Artillery was in short supply. Small arms were better, with Finnish soldiers carrying excellent rifles, but ammunition stocks were limited. Yet the Finnish soldier possessed advantages that could not be measured in equipment inventories. He fought for his home, for land he knew intimately, against an invader whose intentions were unmistakable. This gave Finnish forces a moral clarity and motivation that Soviet soldiers, many of whom had been told they were liberating oppressed Finnish workers from capitalist overlords, conspicuously lacked. The Finnish soldier also benefited from a command structure that encouraged initiative and adaptability, standing in stark contrast to the rigid, top-down Soviet system where junior officers feared taking any action that deviated from orders. Finnish society mobilized for war with remarkable unity. Women took over jobs in factories and farms, organized civil defense, staffed field hospitals, and provided support services for the military. The Lotta Svärd organization, a women's auxiliary named after a legendary figure from Finnish literature who fed soldiers on the battlefield, grew to include nearly 200,000 members. They wore grey-green uniforms and took on tasks ranging from nursing to communications to anti-aircraft observation, freeing men for frontline service. The psychological landscape of Finland in late November 1930 to 1980 mixed resignation with determination. People understood the odds. They knew the Soviet Union possessed virtually unlimited resources and manpower. They had read the newspapers and understood that the world's democracies, preoccupied with the growing conflict in Western Europe, were unlikely to provide meaningful military assistance. Yet alongside this realistic assessment ran a stubborn refusal to simply accept subjugation. Finland had been independent for only 22 years, but that independence had become central to national identity. To surrender it without resistance was unthinkable. The first days, November 30th, and the invasion begins. The morning of November 30th, 1939 dawned cold and clear across Finland. In Helsinki, people woke to what seemed at first like an ordinary winter day. But at 8 o'clock in the morning, before most citizens had finished breakfast, the air raid sirens began their mournful wail. Minutes later, Soviet bombers appeared in the sky above the capital, their engines a distant drone that grew steadily louder. The first bombs fell on residential neighborhoods near the city center. Buildings that had stood for decades crumbled into rubble in seconds. Fires erupted, their smoke rising in black columns against the pale sky. By the time the bombers departed, nearly 100 Finnish civilians lay dead, crushed beneath collapsed walls, or killed by bomb fragments. More than 50 buildings had been destroyed or severely damaged. The message was brutally clear. The Soviet Union intended to wage total war, making no distinction between military and civilian targets. The Foreign Minister Molotov, when confronted by international outrage over the bombing of Helsinki, responded with a lie so brazen it became infamous. He claimed that Soviet aircraft were not dropping bombs, but rather delivering humanitarian aid in the form of food supplies to the starving Finnish population. Finnish citizens, with dark humor characteristic of their response to the war, promptly began calling the Soviet bombs Molotov breadbaskets. Later, when Finnish troops used improvised incendiary weapons against Soviet tanks, they dubbed these makeshift devices Molotov cocktails, a drink to accompany the bread. While Helsinki burned, Along the 700-kilometer border separating Finland from the Soviet Union, the Red Army began its advance. 21 divisions, totaling approximately 450,000 troops, crossed into Finnish territory at multiple points. The scale of the invasion was staggering. Soviet forces brought with them more than 2,000 tanks and nearly 3,000 aircraft. They possessed overwhelming superiority in artillery, with thousands of guns that could reduce fortifications to rubble. The Soviet battle plan reflected the High Command's confidence in a swift victory. The main thrust came through the Karelian Isthmus, where the bulk of Soviet forces aimed to smash through the Mannerheim Line and drive straight for Helsinki. A distance of less than 200 kilometers, secondary offensives were launched in Ladoga Karelia, north of Lake Ladoga, and in the central wilderness regions of Kainuu and Salla. In the far north, Soviet forces moved toward the Arctic port of Petsamo. The strategy assumed that Finnish defenses would crumble quickly under the weight of superior numbers and firepower. What Soviet commanders failed to adequately consider was the nature of Finnish terrain and the approaching severity of winter. Their invasion routes, determined by the limited road network, funneled Soviet columns into predictable paths through the wilderness. The Red Army's emphasis on mechanized warfare, with its reliance on tanks and motorized transport, made these roads essential. But Finnish defenders understood that an army confined to roads became vulnerable, its mobility constrained, its flanks exposed to attack from the surrounding forests. The first encounters between Soviet and Finnish forces established patterns that would persist throughout the war. Soviet troops advanced in overwhelming numbers, confident in their superiority. Finnish defenders, heavily outnumbered, fought delaying actions before falling back to prepared positions. Soviet tactics were heavy-handed and methodical, relying on massed artillery barrages, followed by tanks. Finnish tactics were fluid and improvisational, emphasizing ambushes, flanking maneuvers, and rapid withdrawals before Soviet firepower could be concentrated effectively. In the north, around the village of Suomussalmi, the Soviet 163rd Rifle Division advanced westward along the single road that connected the Soviet border to the town of Oulu on the Gulf of Bothnia. The Soviet plan called for this division to cut Finland in half, severing the northern regions from the south. The division commander had been assured that Finnish resistance would be minimal, that local populations might even welcome Soviet forces as liberators. Reality proved different. Finnish ski troops harassed the Soviet advance, fading into the forests before Soviet troops could bring their superior numbers to bear. On the Karelian Isthmus, Soviet forces reached the Mannerheim Line by early December and began probing attacks against the fortifications. These initial assaults quickly revealed the line's strength. Finnish defenders, protected by concrete bunkers and reinforced with carefully positioned artillery, repelled attack after attack. Soviet troops advanced in dense formations, following doctrine that emphasized mass and momentum. Finnish machine gunners cut them down in appalling numbers. Snow quickly turned red with blood, and corpses began to pile in front of Finnish positions. The cold was already affecting operations. Soviet soldiers, many recruited from warmer regions of the vast Soviet Union, suffered immediately from inadequate winter clothing. Their standard-issue tunics and boots provided little insulation against temperatures that regularly fell below -20 degrees Celsius. In contrast, Finnish troops wore layered woolen clothing, reindeer fur boots, and lightweight white camouflage capes that made them nearly invisible against the snow. Finnish civilians in border regions fled westward ahead of the Soviet advance, carrying whatever possessions they could load onto sleds and carts. Entire villages were evacuated within hours, leaving behind only the elderly who refused to abandon their homes. Soviet forces occupied these empty settlements and began to learn just how unprepared they were for the Finnish winter. Buildings that seemed substantial provided inadequate shelter once their heating systems failed. Fires drew Finnish artillery and sniper fire. Soviet troops huddled in misery, cursing the cold, the snow, and the stubborn Finns who refused to accept the inevitable. The international community watched the invasion with a mixture of sympathy for Finland and recognition of geopolitical realities. On December 14th, the League of Nations voted to expel the Soviet Union, one of the few decisive actions the organization ever took. But condemnation was not the same as assistance. Britain and France, already at war with Germany, lacked the means to provide significant military support. The United States, still clinging to neutrality, offered moral support but little else. Sweden, bound by its own policy of neutrality, struggled with how to help Finland without provoking Soviet aggression against itself. For ordinary Finnish soldiers and civilians, these first days of war brought a rapid education in the realities of modern combat. The sound of artillery became constant background noise. The sight of death became commonplace. Young men who had been students or farmers weeks earlier learned to kill efficiently, to move through killing zones without hesitation, to endure conditions that would have seemed unimaginable in peacetime. This education would continue, growing harsher and more bitter as winter tightened its grip on the land. The cold as weapon, nature joins the battle. The winter of 1930 to 1940 was exceptionally brutal, even by Finnish standards. Meteorological records document temperatures dropping to -43 degrees Celsius on the Karelian Isthmus on January 16, 1940. In Lapland, in the far north, temperatures plunged even lower. These were not brief cold snaps, but sustained periods of extreme cold that tested the limits of human endurance and pushed machines and equipment beyond their design tolerances. At -40 degrees, the world transforms. The air itself seems to crystallize, each breath burning the lungs like fire. Exposed skin begins to freeze within minutes, the flesh turning white and hard as ice crystals. Frostbite creeps silently through fingers and toes, nose and ears, destroying tissue with invisible efficiency. Metal becomes dangerous, conducting away body heat so rapidly that touching it with bare skin can cause instant freezing and adhesion. Water, that essential element of life, becomes a potential death sentence if it soaks into clothing or boots. The Soviet Red Army, for all its numerical superiority and modern equipment, was catastrophically unprepared for these conditions. Many Soviet units came from the southern republics, regions where winter meant mild temperatures and occasional snow. These soldiers had no experience with true Arctic cold, no cultural framework for understanding its dangers. Soviet military doctrine emphasized speed and aggression, not the patient endurance required for winter warfare. The result was suffering on a massive scale. Soviet soldiers wore standard-issue uniforms designed for temperate climates. Their greatcoats, while substantial, provided inadequate insulation when temperatures dropped to extreme levels. Their boots, particularly problematic, had thin soles studded with metal cleats. These cleats, intended to provide traction on ice, instead conducted heat from the feet directly into the frozen ground. The boot's design also allowed snow to enter from the top, where it would melt from body heat and then refreeze, creating blocks of ice around the soldiers' feet. Frostbite ravaged Soviet ranks with the efficiency of an enemy army. In some units, frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties. Men woke in the morning to find their feet blackened and frozen, the tissue already beginning to die. Fingers, constantly exposed while operating weapons, froze stiff and useless. Ears and noses, impossible to protect adequately, developed frostbite that would later require amputation. Soviet medical services, already strained by combat casualties, struggled to cope with a flood of cold weather injuries. The treatment protocols for frostbite in 1939 were primitive by modern standards. Field hospitals attempted to rewarm frozen limbs often too rapidly, causing additional tissue damage. Amputations were performed in canvas tents where temperatures remained well below freezing, surgeons operating with numbed fingers while patients lay on tables little warmer than the snow outside. Many soldiers who survived their initial injuries died later from infections, their immune systems weakened by cold and malnutrition. Soviet equipment failed systematically in the extreme cold. Tank engines refused to start. Their oil thickened to the consistency of paste. Batteries died overnight. Weapons jammed as moving parts contracted and lubricants froze. The T-26 and BT-7 tanks, that formed the backbone of Soviet armor, proved particularly vulnerable. Their diesel engines required preheating before they could be started, a process that took time and fuel. Machine guns that functioned perfectly in temperate climates became unreliable, their mechanisms freezing mid-burst. Soviet troops attempted to cope with the cold using methods that often made their situation worse. They built large fires for warmth, but these fires marked their positions for Finnish artillery and drew sniper fire. They huddled together in buildings, creating condensation that froze on walls and ceilings. They dug foxholes in the frozen earth, but these holes filled with cold air that was even colder than the surface, turning them into freezing pits. Some Soviet soldiers, in desperation, tried to warm themselves with alcohol, not understanding that while alcohol creates an illusion of warmth, it actually accelerates heat loss by dilating blood vessels. Finnish forces, in contrast, operated in the winter environment with the confidence of people for whom such conditions were part of ordinary life. Finnish soldiers dressed in layers, a system that allowed them to regulate body temperature by adding or removing garments as needed. Their base layer consisted of heavy woolen underwear that wickered moisture away from the skin. Over this, they wore wool sweaters and heavy wool trousers. Their boots were lined with reindeer fur, providing excellent insulation while allowing moisture to escape. The outer layer consisted of a lightweight white camouflage cape that broke up their outline against the snow while adding minimal weight. Finnish troops understood the necessity of staying dry. Sweat, which in normal conditions evaporates harmlessly, becomes deadly in extreme cold when it soaks into clothing and then freezes. Finnish soldiers moved at a pace that generated enough warmth to prevent freezing, but not so much that they sweated heavily. They changed their socks frequently, wringing out moisture and warming the damp pairs against their bodies. They knew to breathe through scarves to prevent the moisture in their breath from collecting as ice in their beards and around their mouths. The Finnish military also maintained extensive networks of heated rest areas behind the front lines. Soldiers rotated through these areas regularly, spending time in saunas that restored body warmth and morale. The sauna, a central element of Finnish culture, became a tactical advantage in the Winter War. Photographs from the period show Finnish soldiers emerging from saunas, their bodies pink from heat, running naked through snow to nearby shelters, a stark contrast to Soviet troops who had no such facilities and went weeks without proper bathing. The cold affected warfare in ways both obvious and subtle, snow-muffled sound making it difficult to detect approaching threats. The crunch of boots on frozen snow could be heard from remarkable distances in the still, cold air. Breath vapor betrayed positions. Blood froze almost instantly, leaving dark stains on white snow that marked the location of casualties. The shortened daylight hours meant that much of each day passed in darkness or twilight, favoring defenders who knew the terrain over attackers moving through unfamiliar territory. Lakes and rivers, frozen solid, became highways for movement. Finnish ski troops could traverse these surfaces rapidly, covering distances that would have taken hours through forest. But the ice also created new dangers. Artillery shells striking frozen lakes sometimes punched through, creating holes that were difficult to see until it was too late. Vehicles that attempted to cross ice had to move at specific speeds. Too fast or too slow could cause resonance effects that weakened the ice structure. The forest itself became different in winter. Snow accumulated in the branches of evergreens, bending them down and creating a ceiling that blocked what little daylight penetrated the tree canopy. Visibility dropped to meters in dense stands of trees. Movement off established paths became exhausting as soldiers broke through snow crusts and sank to their waists with every step. The forest that had seemed impenetrable to Soviet forces in autumn became even more hostile in winter. Soviet commanders gradually recognized that winter had become their most dangerous enemy. Reports flowing back to Moscow described units immobilized by cold, equipment failures causing more losses than combat, and morale deteriorating as soldiers struggled simply to survive. The confident predictions of victory by Stalin's birthday on December 21st began to seem impossibly optimistic. The Red Army was learning, at terrible cost, that in Finland during winter, nature itself was a military force that could not be defeated through superior numbers or firepower. Finnish defenders, meanwhile, came to view the cold as an ally. It slowed Soviet advances, degraded Soviet equipment, and inflicted casualties without Finnish forces having to fire a shot. Finnish commanders planned operations with full awareness of temperature forecasts, launching attacks when cold was most severe to maximize Soviet suffering. The harshest winter in decades, which might have been seen as a misfortune, instead became one of Finland's greatest advantages in a war where advantages were desperately scarce. Motti tactics, encirclement, and destruction in the frozen forest. The word motti entered military vocabulary during the Winter War, though its origins lay in Finnish civilian life. A motti, in the context of forestry, referred to a cubic meter of firewood, logs stacked and held in place by stakes, ready to be chopped into smaller pieces. Finnish soldiers, looking at Soviet columns stretched along narrow forest roads, saw a similar pattern. Large enemy forces that could be isolated, divided, and destroyed piecemeal. Thus was born the motti tactic, one of the Winter War's most distinctive and devastating innovations. The motti tactic exploited fundamental weaknesses in Soviet operational methods and the constraining nature of Finnish terrain. Soviet forces advanced along the limited road network in long columns, tanks and trucks, and artillery pieces stretching for kilometers. These columns moved slowly, vulnerable to disruption. Soviet commanders, trained in the doctrine of deep operations and maneuver warfare, found themselves confined to single-lane forest tracks where their mobility advantage evaporated. The surrounding wilderness, which Soviet troops could not traverse effectively, became enemy territory that Finnish forces dominated. The execution of a motti operation typically unfolded in 3 phases. First came reconnaissance, as Finnish ski patrols identified suitable targets. Soviet units extended along roads, preferably at points where terrain made it difficult to deploy off the road. Finnish scouts would spend days observing Soviet movements, noting the locations of headquarters elements, supply dumps, and weak points in the column. This intelligence gathering required extraordinary patience and skill, as scouts had to operate close to enemy positions without being detected. The second phase involved segmentation. Finnish forces would strike simultaneously at multiple points along the Soviet column, typically establishing strong roadblocks at the head and tail of the column. These blocks, often consisting of anti-tank obstacles, reinforced by machine gun positions and anti-tank guns, prevented the Soviet force from moving forward or retreating. Additional strikes at intervals along the column then divided it into smaller segments, each isolated from mutual support. The goal was to create multiple motis, each containing a portion of the original Soviet force, unable to coordinate with other segments. The final phase was annihilation. Finnish forces would attack the smallest and weakest motis first, destroying them completely and capturing their weapons and supplies. Larger motis were contained but not immediately assaulted. Instead, Finnish troops subjected them to constant harassment, sniper fire, small raids, artillery bombardment when available. The cold did much of the work. Trapped Soviet forces, unable to maneuver and lacking adequate shelter, gradually weakened as casualties from frostbite and hunger accumulated. Supply drops by aircraft were attempted but proved insufficient. Eventually, when Soviet resistance had been degraded sufficiently, Finnish forces would launch a final assault to destroy the moti completely. The Battle of Suomussalmi, fought from December 7th through January 8th, provided the classic demonstration of moti tactics. The small town of Suomussalmi, with a population of about 4,000, sat in the Kainuu region of eastern Finland, surrounded by dense forests and numerous lakes. Two roads led from the Soviet border to Suomussalmi, the northern Juntusranta Road and the southern Raate Road. Soviet planners viewed Suomussalmi as a strategic objective. Capturing it would allow Soviet forces to drive westward to Oulu on the Gulf of Bothnia, effectively cutting Finland in 2 p.m. The Soviet 163rd Rifle Division advanced along the Juntusranta Road in early December, reaching Suomussalmi on December 7th and occupying the town with minimal resistance. Finnish forces had fallen back, and Soviet commanders congratulated themselves on a swift victory. What they failed to recognize was that they had walked into a trap. Finnish Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo, commanding the 9th Division, was already planning the Soviet division's destruction. Silasvuo's plan was audacious. Despite being outnumbered, he intended to encircle and destroy the entire Soviet division. Finnish forces, moving rapidly on skis through terrain that Soviet troops found impassable, began severing the 163rd Division's supply lines. Finnish ski battalions struck Soviet outposts, overwhelming them before disappearing back into the forest. By late December, the Soviet division was effectively isolated in Suomussalmi, cut off from reinforcement or resupply. Meanwhile, the Soviet 44th Rifle Division, a Ukrainian formation considered elite by Soviet standards, advanced along the Raate Road to relieve the 161st of the mountain. The 44th Division was well equipped with modern weapons, substantial armor, and motorized transport. It also had a regimental band, complete with instruments, intended to provide morale and entertainment. The division's commander had been assured that linking up with the 163rd would be routine, a simple road march through wilderness where the enemy was in retreat. The reality was catastrophically different. The rated road wound through some of Finland's most inhospitable terrain, a single-lane track flanked by dense forest and frozen lakes. The 44th Division stretched along this road in a column, nearly 20 kilometers long, moving slowly as vehicles struggled with the cold and the poor road surface. Finnish forces, watching from the forest, chose their moment carefully. On January 5, 1940, Finnish troops struck simultaneously along the entire length of the Soviet column. Explosives destroyed bridges ahead of and behind the division. Finnish ski troops established blocking positions at both ends of the column and at key points along its length. The 44th Division, which that morning had been confident in its mission, found itself by evening chopped into numerous isolated segments, each surrounded by Finnish forces that seemed to materialize from the forest itself. What followed was methodical destruction. Finnish troops attacked the weakest motis, overwhelming Soviet defensive positions and capturing weapons and supplies. Larger Soviet strongpoints were subjected to continuous pressure. Finnish snipers, virtually invisible in their white camouflage, picked off Soviet officers and anyone who exposed themselves. Finnish ski patrols launched night raids, creating panic and preventing Soviet troops from resting. The cold steadily weakened Soviet resistance. Soviet troops fought bravely, but bravery could not overcome their situation. They attempted to build defensive positions, but the frozen ground made digging nearly impossible. They used their tanks as static pillboxes, but the tanks' fuel quickly ran out, and they became metal coffins as cold seeped inside. They tried to break out, organizing desperate charges against Finnish positions, but these attacks faltered in the face of concentrated Finnish fire and the exhaustion of troops already weakened by cold and hunger. By January 8th, the 44th Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Approximately 9,000 Soviet soldiers died on the Raate Road. Frozen corpses scattered along 20 kilometers of forest track. Finnish forces captured extraordinary amounts of equipment. Dozens of tanks, hundreds of vehicles, artillery pieces, machine guns, rifles, ammunition. The Finns also captured the division's cash box, containing soldiers' pay and the musical instruments from the regimental band, which became macabre trophies of an utterly one-sided victory. The psychological impact of the Rate Road battle reverberated throughout the Soviet military and far beyond. Here was a Red Army division, well equipped and supposedly elite, utterly annihilated by Finnish forces, perhaps a third its size. The ratio of casualties was staggering. For every Finnish soldier killed, approximately 30 Soviet soldiers died. The battle demonstrated both the effectiveness of Finnish tactics and the fatal combination of Soviet doctrinal rigidity and winter warfare inexperience. Motti tactics were employed throughout the Winter War with varying degrees of success. Not every Motti operation resulted in complete destruction of Soviet forces. Larger Soviet units, once surrounded, sometimes managed to hold out long enough for relief forces to break through. Soviet commanders learned from their early disasters, adopting tighter formations and more cautious advance procedures. They began using ski troops of their own, though these were never as effective as their Finnish counterparts. They established stronger defensive perimeters when halted, creating fortified positions that were more difficult for Finnish forces to reduce. Yet the Motti remained a threat that haunted Soviet operations throughout the war. The psychological effect was perhaps as important as the tactical results. Soviet soldiers advancing through Finnish forests knew that at any moment they might find themselves cut off, surrounded, slowly freezing to death while an invisible enemy picked them apart. This knowledge eroded morale and made Soviet forces cautious, slowing their advances even when Finnish resistance was light. The success of Motti tactics depended on several factors that were unique to the Finnish situation. Finnish ski troops possessed mobility that Soviet forces could not match, allowing them to move rapidly through terrain that channelized Soviet movement. The forest provided concealment for Finnish forces while denying it to Soviet troops who lacked winter camouflage and forest warfare training. The cold weakened trapped Soviet forces more rapidly than Finnish attackers who could rotate back to warm rest areas. And Finnish forces were defending their homeland, which meant that every kilometer of forest was familiar territory to at least some soldiers, while Soviet troops operated in a landscape that remained alien and hostile. The Motti tactic represented improvisation born of necessity. Finland could not meet Soviet forces in conventional pitched battles and hope to win. Finnish numerical and material inferiority made such confrontations suicidal. But by avoiding direct confrontation, by using mobility and terrain to isolate and destroy enemy forces piecemeal, Finnish commanders found a way to inflict disproportionate casualties while preserving their own limited forces. It was warfare adapted perfectly to circumstances. Warfare that turned Finnish weaknesses into strengths and Soviet strengths into vulnerabilities. The human cost. Physical devastation in flesh and bone. The archive contains medical documents that make for grim reading. Field hospital reports written in cramped handwriting on forms stained with blood and mud. Statistical summaries that reduce human suffering to columns of numbers, photographs of wounds, and amputations that even decades later retain their power to disturb. These documents tell the story of what war and extreme cold did to human bodies, a story of suffering that exceeded what most people in more temperate climates can easily imagine. Frostbite dominated the medical records. In some Finnish field hospitals during the coldest periods, frostbite cases outnumbered combat wounds by ratios of 3 or 4 to 1. The progression of frostbite followed a cruel pattern. Initially, the affected area would become numb and pale as blood vessels constricted in an attempt to preserve core body temperature. If warming occurred at this stage, recovery was possible with minimal permanent damage. But if exposure continued, ice crystals would form in the extracellular fluid, and as these crystals grew, they would damage cell walls and structures. The rewarming process, necessary to save tissue, brought excruciating pain. Soldiers who had felt nothing while their feet froze would scream when circulation returned, the damaged nerves suddenly functioning again and transmitting overwhelming pain signals. Medical personnel had to perform this rewarming carefully, as too rapid warming could cause additional tissue damage. The standard protocol involved immersing the frozen extremity in water, heated to between 37 and 40 degrees Celsius, carefully monitored to prevent burns on tissue that had lost protective sensation. Even with proper treatment, severe frostbite often led to gangrene as damaged tissue died and began to decay. The stench of gangrenous tissue became a constant presence in field hospitals, a sickly sweet smell that medical personnel could never entirely escape. The only treatment for advanced gangrene was amputation, surgery performed under primitive conditions by surgeons who sometimes operated for 18 or 20 hours straight as casualties flooded in. Amputation statistics from the Winter War make sobering reading. Finnish medical services performed thousands of amputations, mostly of toes, fingers, and feet, but also hands, lower legs, and in extreme cases, entire limbs. Soviet forces experienced even higher amputation rates, their inadequate cold weather preparation translating directly into mutilated bodies. Young men who had been whole and healthy at the beginning of winter emerged, if they emerged at all, as amputees who would spend the rest of their lives learning to function without the body parts they had lost. Combat wounds added to the suffering. Bullets and shell fragments tore through flesh with the same efficiency as in any war, but the cold complicated treatment in ways that doctors in warmer climates did not have to consider. Blood loss became more immediately critical because the cold accelerated hypothermia in wounded soldiers. A soldier shot in the abdomen, already facing potentially fatal internal bleeding, also had to contend with rapid loss of core body temperature as shock set in and his body's thermoregulation failed. Field hospitals operated under conditions that challenged even experienced medical personnel. Many hospitals were established in schools, churches and other civilian buildings, structures that had heating systems but were never designed as medical facilities. Operating rooms were set up in classrooms where children had studied weeks earlier. Recovery wards filled gymnasiums and parish halls. The smell of antiseptic and blood mixed with wood smoke from stoves working overtime to maintain some semblance of warmth. Finnish medical services were stretched desperately thin. Finland had approximately 700 doctors at the start of the war, a number that had to serve both military and civilian needs. Medical supplies, particularly morphine and antiseptics, ran dangerously low at various points. Nurses and orderlies worked to exhaustion, caring for far more patients than proper medical practice allowed. Yet they maintained remarkably high standards under these constraints, with mortality rates among wounded who reached field hospitals comparable to those of much larger and better equipped militaries. The Lottersford organization provided essential medical support. These women, wearing their grey-green uniforms, served as nurses' aides, ambulance drivers, and hospital administrators. They also provided crucial psychological support, a comforting presence in the midst of horror. Many young Finnish soldiers, wounded and frightened, found solace in being cared for by women who reminded them of their mothers or sisters, voices speaking Finnish rather than the harsh Russian of the enemy. Soviet medical services faced even greater challenges. The Red Army's medical corps had been decimated during Stalin's purges, with many experienced doctors and surgeons executed or imprisoned. Those who remained often lacked the resources to provide adequate care. Soviet field hospitals were frequently established in canvas tents where temperatures remained below freezing. Wounded soldiers lay on the frozen ground, covered by thin blankets, waiting for treatment that might never come. Medical supplies were insufficient, and the Soviet supply system's inefficiencies meant that critical items often failed to reach the front. Soviet soldiers wounded and left behind during retreats faced particularly horrific fates. Finnish forces, adhering to international conventions, generally treated captured wounded with the same care as their own casualties. But soldiers who lay wounded in no man's land between the lines could freeze to death in hours. The cold acted as both blessing and curse. It slowed bleeding and reduced pain through natural anesthesia, but it also killed efficiently. Soviet commanders sometimes heard wounded soldiers calling out for help from positions that could not be safely reached, their voices growing weaker over hours until they finally fell silent. Malnutrition compounded the effects of cold and combat wounds. Soviet forces, particularly those trapped in moty, often went days with minimal food. The body's ability to generate heat depends on caloric intake, and soldiers whose rations were inadequate found themselves increasingly vulnerable to cold. Soviet medical reports document cases of soldiers whose frostbite was directly attributable to insufficient food rather than inadequate clothing. A well-fed soldier could survive conditions that killed a hungry one. Disease added another layer of misery. Crowded conditions in bunkers and dugouts, combined with inadequate sanitation and the difficulty of maintaining hygiene in extreme cold, created perfect conditions for the spread of illness. Respiratory infections were endemic, made worse by the cold air and the smoke from wood fires used for heating. Dysentery struck both Soviet and Finnish forces, though Finnish forces managed the problem more effectively through better discipline and supply systems. The psychological toll of witnessing so much suffering affected medical personnel on both sides. Nurses and doctors saw young men die from wounds that in better circumstances might have been survivable. They performed triage, making agonizing decisions about which soldiers would receive limited medical resources and which would be left to die. They worked until their own health failed, then returned to work as soon as they could stand. The letters and diaries of Finnish medical personnel speak of nightmares, of inability to forget the faces of those they could not save, of a grief that became a constant companion. Finnish civilians played crucial roles in medical support. Private homes near the front lines were converted into casualty clearing stations. Women who had never seen serious injuries before found themselves bandaging wounds and comforting dying soldiers. Farmers used their sleds to transport wounded across snow-covered fields to roads where ambulances could reach them. Entire communities mobilized to support the medical effort, donating blood, providing bedding and supplies, taking in recovering soldiers who had no other place to convalesce. The archival medical records also document small moments of humanity amid the horror. Finnish surgeons operating on captured Soviet soldiers with the same skill they applied to Finnish casualties, driven by professional ethics that transcended national enmity. Soviet prisoners who recovered from their wounds, expressing gratitude to the Finnish medical personnel who had saved them. Letters from Finnish soldiers to the nurses who had cared for them, expressing appreciation that these women would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The physical devastation of the Winter War extended beyond the immediate casualties. Many soldiers who survived carried permanent injuries that affected them for decades. Amputees had to relearn basic tasks. Those who suffered severe frostbite but kept their extremities often dealt with chronic pain, reduced circulation, and extreme sensitivity to cold for the rest of their lives. Respiratory damage from breathing frigid air led to chronic bronchitis and other lung diseases that shortened lives. The war's human cost was not measured only in the dead, but in the years of reduced quality of life experienced by survivors. The psychological warfare, mental strain, and the weight of winter darkness. The human mind, like the human body, has limits beyond which it cannot function. The Winter War tested these limits systematically, subjecting soldiers on both sides to psychological pressures that were perhaps as devastating as the physical hardships. The archived diaries and letters from the period reveal inner landscapes of fear, exhaustion, and slowly eroding hope, documents that open windows into the mental experience of warfare under extreme conditions. The darkness itself was a form of psychological assault. Finnish winter days in December and January lasted only a few hours, and in the far north, the sun did not rise at all for weeks. Soldiers fought, lived, and often died in near-perpetual darkness or twilight. The absence of light affected human circadian rhythms, disrupting sleep patterns and contributing to a general sense of disorientation. Time became fluid in the darkness, hours blending together until soldiers lost track of whether it was day or night. The darkness also amplified fear. Soviet soldiers, huddled in defensive positions or advancing through Black Forest, jumped at every sound. Shadows moved in ways that suggested enemies where there were none. The crack of a branch breaking under snow's weight could trigger panic shooting. Finnish forces, who understood this, deliberately exploited Soviet fear of the dark, launching raids during the deepest part of night, making noise to suggest forces much larger than they actually were, then disappearing before Soviet troops could organize effective responses. The cold's psychological effects were insidious. Extreme cold requires constant attention to survival, a mental burden that never lifted. Soldiers had to remain perpetually aware of their extremities, wiggling toes and fingers to maintain circulation, checking for the warning signs of frostbite. They had to monitor their clothing, ensuring no sweat accumulated that could freeze. They had to ration their movement to avoid exhaustion while generating enough activity to stay warm. This constant low-level stress wore away mental resilience as surely as water wears away stone. Sleep deprivation affected everyone but hit Soviet forces particularly hard. Finnish troops, fighting from prepared positions with established rotation schedules and warm rest areas nearby, could maintain something approaching adequate rest. Soviet troops, advancing through hostile territory or trapped in mortie, often went days with minimal sleep. They could not rest properly in the cold. The danger of freezing to death while unconscious was too real. They had to maintain watch against Finnish attacks that could come at any time. The combination of cold, fear, and sleeplessness created a state of mental fog where judgment faltered and mistakes multiplied. Combat stress, known in previous wars as shell shock, and in later conflicts as post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested in ways that reflected the Winter War's unique conditions. Finnish soldiers, after extended periods of intense combat followed by silent watching in frozen positions, sometimes developed what was called bunker psychosis, a condition characterized by extreme jumpiness, inability to distinguish real threats from imagined ones, and occasionally complete mental breakdown. Soviet soldiers exhibited similar symptoms, compounded by the additional stress of being in enemy territory with inadequate supplies and the knowledge that capture or injury in the cold might mean death. The sound of artillery became a constant psychological presence. The whistle of incoming shells, the concussive blast that could be felt as much as heard, the shrapnel hissing through air and cutting down trees. These sounds created an environment of constant tension. Soldiers learned to distinguish between outgoing and incoming fire, between the sound of shells that would land nearby and those that would pass overhead. This auditory hypervigilance, necessary for survival, also meant that soldiers could never truly relax even when in rear areas supposedly safe from attack. Death's omnipresence took its toll. The frozen corpses of the dead remained visible for weeks, preserved by the cold, constant reminders of mortality. Soviet troops advancing along roads where earlier offensives had failed found themselves walking past frozen Russian dead from previous battles, bodies stacked like cordwood beside the road or sprawled in the positions where they had died. Finnish defenders grew accustomed to looking out from their positions at no man's land littered with frozen Soviet soldiers, some in positions suggesting peaceful sleep, others caught in attitudes of agony or desperation. Letters and diaries reveal the psychological coping mechanisms soldiers developed. Finnish soldiers wrote frequently about the rightness of their cause, defending their homeland against unprovoked aggression. This moral clarity provided a framework for understanding their suffering, a reason to endure. They wrote about their families, about the homes and farms and towns they were defending. They wrote about small moments of beauty, a particularly vivid sunset, the northern lights dancing in the sky, the perfect silence of the forest after fresh snowfall. Soviet soldiers' writings reveal more ambivalence and confusion. Many had been told they were liberating oppressed Finnish workers from capitalist exploitation, but the reality they encountered, determined resistance from ordinary Finns who showed no sign of welcoming liberation, contradicted this narrative. Some Soviet soldiers wrote about doubts, carefully veiled because expressing them openly was dangerous. Others focused on survival, on getting through each day and hoping to return home. Still others tried to maintain belief in the Soviet system and the rightness of their mission, though their conviction sometimes rings hollow in retrospect. The treatment of prisoners added another psychological dimension. Finnish forces, though resource-constrained, generally treated Soviet prisoners according to international law. Captured Soviets were fed, given medical attention, and housed in conditions that, while Spartan, were considerably better than what they had endured at the front. This relatively humane treatment confused some Soviet soldiers, who had been told that the Finns were fascist monsters who would torture prisoners. Finnish interrogators found that many Soviet prisoners, once they realized they were not going to be executed or tortured, became surprisingly cooperative, some even expressing relief at being out of the fighting. Soviet treatment of Finnish prisoners varied more widely. Some Finnish prisoners reported reasonable treatment, while others endured harsh conditions and brutal interrogation. The Soviet political officers viewed the war through an ideological lens that sometimes trumped military professionalism. They struggled to understand why Finnish workers and farmers fought so determinedly against what the Soviets saw as liberation. This cognitive dissonance sometimes manifested in anger directed at Finnish prisoners. The psychological impact on civilians, particularly those displaced by the war, was profound. Finnish civilians, fleeing their homes ahead of the Soviet advance, left behind everything they had built over lifetimes. They became refugees in their own country, dependent on the charity of strangers, uncertain if they would ever return. The elderly, who remembered Russian rule before Finnish independence, faced their worst nightmares coming true. Children, too young to fully understand what was happening, absorbed their parents' fear and stress, trauma that would shape them for years to come. Finnish resistance was sustained partly by shared cultural narratives about survival against impossible odds. The concept of saisu, that peculiarly Finnish quality of stubborn perseverance, was invoked constantly. Soldiers reminded each other and themselves that Finns had survived worse, that their ancestors had endured, that they too would endure. These cultural narratives provided psychological armor against despair, a framework for making sense of suffering and finding meaning in continued resistance. The gradual recognition among Soviet forces that this would not be a quick, easy victory created its own psychological crisis. Soviet soldiers had been promised they would be home by New Year, that Finnish resistance would collapse quickly. When January arrived and Finnish resistance remained fierce, when Soviet casualties continued to mount, morale plummeted. Officers struggled to maintain discipline in units whose confidence had been shattered by repeated defeats and the constant cold. Music provided psychological relief for both sides. Finnish soldiers sang folk songs around fires during rest periods, songs about their homeland, about love and loss, about the natural world they were defending. These songs connected them to their culture and reminded them why they fought. Soviet political officers organized singing sessions as well, patriotic songs about Stalin and the Soviet motherland, though these seem to have been less effective at boosting morale, possibly because the disconnect between the song's triumphant messages and the soldiers' grim reality was too obvious. The psychological wounds of the Winter War persisted long after the physical wounds healed. Finnish veterans dealt with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, though in 1940 it had no such name. They experienced nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, difficulty readjusting to civilian life. Some turned to alcohol to numb their memories. Others withdrew into themselves, unable to speak about what they had experienced, even to their families. Finnish society, still small and close-knit, provided some support through shared understanding. Nearly everyone had lost someone or had family members who fought, but formal psychological support was minimal. Soviet veterans faced additional challenges. The Soviet system did not acknowledge psychological trauma as legitimate. Soldiers were expected to return to normal life immediately, and those who struggled were viewed with suspicion. Some Soviet veterans of the Winter War found themselves accused of insufficient devotion to the Soviet cause, their difficulties interpreted as ideological weakness rather than the natural human response to extreme trauma. Many carried their burdens silently, never speaking of the frozen forests and the friends who had died there, the memories locked away but never forgotten. Technical and material challenges. When machines meet the Finnish winter, the archived technical reports and engineering assessments from the Winter War read like catalogues of cascading failures. Machines designed for temperate climates met conditions they were never intended to withstand, and the results ranged from inconvenient to catastrophic. The archive contains photographs of tanks frozen solid, their hatches sealed shut by ice, their treads locked in place. There are diagrams showing weapon modifications attempted in the field, hasty improvisations sketched on whatever paper was available. There are reports written by engineers struggling to solve problems that had no good solutions. Soviet tanks, the pride of Red Army mechanized doctrine, became liabilities in the Finnish winter. The T-26 light tank and BT-7 fast tank formed the backbone of Soviet armor in the Winter War. Both were diesel-powered, and diesel fuel thickens dramatically at low temperatures. At -40 degrees, diesel becomes a gel with a consistency of soft wax, completely unusable. Soviet tank crews learned to their horror that their vehicles, which would start reliably in temperate conditions, refused to start in Finnish winter cold. The standard procedure for starting diesel tanks in extreme cold involved preheating the engines using blowtorches or fires built underneath the engine compartment, a process that took considerable time and fuel. But this procedure had to be repeated every time the engine was shut off, which meant tanks left idle overnight would be immobilized by morning. Soviet tank crews began leaving their engines running continuously, which consumed enormous amounts of fuel and created maintenance problems as engines wore out from constant use. Some crews, desperate to keep their vehicles mobile, fed their tanks fuel to fires used to heat other tanks' engines, sacrificing mobility of some vehicles to preserve mobility of others. Even when engines would start, cold affected tank performance in multiple ways. Metal components contracted, sometimes causing parts to seize or crack. Lubricants thickened, increasing friction and wear. The hydraulic systems used to traverse turrets became sluggish or failed entirely. Tank tracks became brittle in the cold, cracking under stress that they would normally handle easily. One Soviet tank commander's report describes his frustration watching his tank's tread simply shatter as the vehicle attempted to climb a small incline, the frozen rubber and metal unable to flex as designed. Finnish anti-tank tactics exploited these vulnerabilities ruthlessly. Finnish soldiers discovered that Soviet tanks confined to roads by the terrain and slowed by mechanical problems were relatively easy targets. The standard Finnish anti-tank weapon was the Molotov cocktail, that improvised incendiary device that became synonymous with the Winter War. Finnish troops would approach immobilized tanks, often moving on skis, and throw bottles filled with gasoline thickened with tar and rubber. The mixture would ignite on impact, and if it splashed through engine vents or hatches, it could set the entire vehicle ablaze. The psychological effect on Soviet tank crews was devastating. Tank warfare doctrine emphasized protection. Crews inside armored vehicles were supposed to be safe from small arms fire. But in Finland, that protection became a trap. Tanks that broke down or got stuck became metal coffins. Finnish infantry would surround disabled vehicles and either destroy them with Molotov cocktails or simply wait for the cold to force crews out. Soviet tankers began to fear their own vehicles, knowing that mechanical failure in Finnish territory meant probable death. Artillery, less affected by cold than tanks, still faced significant challenges. Gun mechanisms required careful maintenance to prevent freezing. Hydraulic recoil systems sometimes froze solid, turning artillery pieces into dangerous weapons that could destroy themselves when fired. Ammunition storage was complicated by the need to keep shells at stable temperatures. Extreme cold affected propellant burn rates and could cause rounds to be inaccurate or fail to detonate. Soviet artillery crews worked in brutal conditions, manhandling heavy shells with numbed fingers, trying to maintain firing schedules while the cold sapped their strength. Small arms proved more reliable, but still required constant attention. The Finnish Morsin Nagant rifle, standard issue for Finnish infantry, was a robust weapon that functioned reasonably well in cold conditions. Finnish soldiers understood the need to keep their weapons free of moisture, which could freeze and cause malfunctions. They learned to breathe away from their weapons to prevent condensation from their breath forming ice on metal parts. They knew to clean their rifles frequently and to use minimal lubrication, as too much oil would thicken and cause jams. Soviet small arms had similar designs, but were maintained less effectively. Soviet soldiers, Many inexperienced and poorly trained sometimes did not understand proper cold weather weapon care. Rifles that were immaculately clean and perfectly functional in temperate climates jammed in Finnish cold because condensation had frozen in the action. Machine guns, particularly water-cooled models, proved especially problematic. The water in cooling jackets would freeze, expanding and sometimes cracking the jackets. Some Soviet crews attempted to use antifreeze, but supplies were limited and the practice never became universal. The Suomi KP-31 submachine gun gave Finnish troops a significant tactical advantage. This weapon, designed and manufactured in Finland, was specifically engineered for cold weather reliability. Its simple blowback mechanism required minimal lubrication and functioned reliably even at extreme temperatures. The Suomi 7.1 round drum magazine provided sustained firepower that was particularly effective in close-range forest combat. Soviet troops who encountered Finnish soldiers equipped with Suomi submachine guns often reported being pinned down by overwhelming fire from what seemed like small numbers of Finns. Aircraft operations were severely constrained by weather. The Finnish Air Force's limited number of aircraft struggled with maintenance in the cold, but Finnish ground crews developed effective procedures for keeping their planes operational. They used heated hangars when available and covered engines with insulated blankets when they were not. They preheated engines before starting attempts and inspected aircraft carefully for ice accumulation that could affect aerodynamics or weight distribution. The Soviet Air Force, despite its numerical superiority, faced worse problems. Soviet airfields in the region were often primitive, lacking proper hangars or maintenance facilities. Aircraft left outside overnight became encased in ice and snow that had to be removed before flight, a time-consuming process. Soviet bombers flying missions over Finland encountered conditions their crews had not trained for. Extreme cold at altitude that caused instruments to fail, icing that affected control surfaces, visibility reduced to near zero by snow and clouds. Many Soviet aircraft were lost not to Finnish anti-aircraft fire, but to weather-related accidents. Communications equipment failed regularly in the cold. Radio batteries died quickly, their chemistry unable to function at low temperatures. Some units attempted to keep radio batteries warm by carrying them inside their clothing, against their bodies. But this was only partially effective. Wire communications, which might have been more reliable, were difficult to maintain because the ground was frozen too hard to bury cables properly, and exposed wires were vulnerable to artillery fire and breakage in the cold. Soviet logistical systems, complex even in ideal conditions, broke down under the strain of Finnish winter. Trucks transporting supplies suffered the same diesel fuel problems as tanks. Tires became brittle and cracked. Cooling systems froze despite antifreeze. The Soviet supply chain, never particularly efficient, could not keep pace with the enormous consumption rates of units fighting in extreme cold. Soldiers needed more food to generate body heat, more fuel to warm shelters, more ammunition because combat was continuous. The limited road network made resupply slow and dangerous, with Finnish forces ambushing supply convoys regularly. Finnish forces faced logistical challenges as well, but they benefited from defending on home territory with established supply lines and local knowledge. Finnish supply columns could use forest trails that were impassable to Soviet vehicles. Local civilians provided food and shelter. Finnish soldiers, familiar with the terrain, could find their way even in blizzard conditions. When Finnish forces had to retreat, they employed scorched earth tactics, destroying supplies and infrastructure that might benefit the enemy, a brutal necessity that Finnish civilians accepted with grim determination. The improvisation forced by material shortages led to innovations that became legendary. The Molotov cocktail, already mentioned, was refined by Finns into an effective anti-tank weapon, complete with ignition mechanisms that ensured reliable detonation on impact. Finnish soldiers modified, captured Soviet weapons, sometimes creating hybrid weapons that combined Soviet and Finnish parts. They manufactured replacement parts in field workshops, blacksmiths and mechanics adapting their civilian skills to military needs. The cold even affected something as basic as food. Canned goods froze solid and had to be thawed before consumption, a process that required heat and time that soldiers often lacked. Bread froze into rock-hard masses that could chip teeth. Coffee, that essential morale booster, had to be consumed immediately after preparation or it would freeze in the cup. Finnish troops adapted by carrying food inside their clothing, where body heat kept it from freezing. Soviet troops, less experienced with extreme cold, often did not take this precaution and found themselves with rations they could not eat. Medical supplies faced similar challenges. Morphine for wounded soldiers froze and became unusable. Intravenous fluids had to be warmed before administration. Plasma for blood transfusions required careful temperature management. Finnish medical services developed protocols for protecting critical supplies from cold, but Soviet medical units often lacked the equipment or knowledge to do so effectively, leading to situations where supplies were available but unusable. The material challenges of the Winter War demonstrated that advanced technology meant little if it could not function in the operational environment. Soviet forces possessed superior numbers and equipment on paper, but much of that advantage evaporated when machines froze, fuel gelled, and complex systems failed. Finnish forces, with simpler equipment maintained by soldiers who understood cold weather operations, achieved effectiveness far beyond what their material resources suggested should be possible. The lesson was clear. In war, adaptability and understanding of environmental conditions can matter more than technological sophistication. The broader context and legacy, international reactions and lasting impacts. The Winter War captured international attention in ways that surprised both the Soviet Union and Finland. In newspapers from New York to London to Buenos Aires, front-page stories chronicled Finland's resistance against overwhelming odds. Editorial cartoons depicted David versus Goliath, with tiny Finland holding off the Soviet bear. Public opinion, particularly in Western democracies, strongly favored Finland. The image of a small democracy, defending itself against totalitarian aggression, resonated powerfully in a world already sliding toward global war. International support for Finland took multiple forms, though none proved decisive militarily. Sweden, bound by its policy of neutrality, nonetheless provided extensive covert assistance. Swedish volunteers, ultimately numbering about 8,000, crossed into Finland to join the fight. Sweden sent aircraft, artillery, rifles, and ammunition, supplies that Finland desperately needed. King Gustav V of Sweden publicly expressed support for Finland, though the Swedish government had to balance this against fear of provoking Soviet aggression against Sweden itself. Western democracies offered sympathy and limited material support. Britain and France sent aircraft and artillery, though these arrived slowly and in smaller quantities than Finland needed. The United States, still officially neutral, allowed private aid organizations to raise money and supplies for Finland. American public opinion strongly favored Finland, with even isolationists making exceptions to support Finnish resistance. President Franklin Roosevelt navigated a careful path, expressing moral support while avoiding actions that would compromise American neutrality. The most ambitious Western support plan was never implemented. Britain and France developed schemes to send an expeditionary force to Finland through Norway and Sweden, plans that would have given them control over Swedish iron ore mines that supplied Nazi Germany. Sweden and Norway refused passage, recognizing correctly that allowing Allied forces transit would draw them into the war. The entire plan was probably more about Allied strategic interests than genuine desire to help Finland, but its failure meant that Finland fought alone. The League of Nations' expulsion of the Soviet Union on December 14, 1939, marked one of the organization's few decisive actions, but it came too late to matter. The League had failed to prevent Japanese aggression in Manchuria, Italian aggression in Ethiopia, and German remilitarization. Its expulsion of the Soviet Union for invading Finland was symbolically satisfying, but practically meaningless. The League, already discredited and impotent, would not survive the war that was consuming Europe. Soviet strategy evolved as the war continued. The initial confident assaults gave way to more methodical approaches. Stalin replaced failed commanders, bringing in more competent leadership. Soviet forces adopted better cold weather equipment and tactics, learning painfully from their early disasters. In February 1940, the Red Army launched a massive offensive against the Mannerheim Line, concentrating overwhelming force at key points and grinding through Finnish defenses through sheer weight of numbers and firepower. The fighting in February and early March 1940 reached levels of intensity that exceeded even the earlier bitter battles. Soviet artillery bombardments pulverized Finnish positions. Soviet troops, better equipped and more experienced than in November, pressed attacks relentlessly. Finnish casualties mounted to unsustainable levels. The small Finnish army was simply running out of soldiers. Some units had taken 70% casualties and were held together only by the determination of survivors. Finland requested peace negotiations in late February. A recognition that continued resistance would lead to total defeat and possible occupation. Stalin, eager to end a war that had damaged Soviet prestige and revealed serious Red Army deficiencies, was willing to negotiate. The Treaty of Moscow, signed on March 1340, ended the Winter War on terms that were harsh but short of total capitulation. Finland ceded approximately 11% of its territory, including the entire Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viipuri, Finland's second largest city and strategic areas in northern Finland. Approximately 420,000 Finns, nearly 12% of the population, were displaced from the ceded territories. These people, the evacuees, abandoned their homes and farms to resettle in what remained of Finland, a massive population transfer accomplished with remarkable organization. but tremendous human costs. The human toll of the Winter War was staggering relative to Finland's small population. Finnish casualties totaled approximately 70,000, of whom roughly 25,000 died. This represented about 1% of the entire population dead and another percent seriously wounded. Nearly every Finnish family lost someone or had someone wounded. Soviet casualties were far higher, though exact numbers remain contested. Conservative estimates place Soviet dead at 126,000, with another 300,000 wounded. Some historians argue the actual Soviet casualties were significantly higher. The Winter War's impact extended far beyond its immediate participants. Adolf Hitler, watching from Germany, drew conclusions about Soviet military weakness that would influence his decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941. The Red Army's poor performance convinced Hitler that the Soviet Union was vulnerable, a massive miscalculation that would eventually contribute to Nazi Germany's defeat. Stalin, meanwhile, recognized the urgent need for military reforms. The failures in Finland drove changes in Soviet military doctrine, equipment and training that made the Red Army more effective in the later fight against Germany. For Finland, the Winter War was not the end, but merely a prelude. In June 1940, Finland allied with Nazi Germany and re-entered the war against the Soviet Union in what Finns call the Continuation War, an attempt to regain lost territories. This decision, born from the bitterness of the Winter War's territorial losses and fear of further Soviet aggression, placed Finland in an awkward position as co-belligerent with Nazi Germany while maintaining that it fought a separate war. The Continuation War lasted until 1944 and ended with Finland surviving as an independent nation, but firmly in the Soviet sphere of influence for the next 4 decades. The memory of the Winter War became central to Finnish national identity. The conflict represented Finland's finest hour, a moment when the nation stood alone against impossible odds and survived. The war produced national heroes like Simo Häyhä, the sniper credited with over 500 kills, and reinforced cultural values of resilience and independence. Finnish schools taught the Winter War as an example of what Sisu could accomplish. Veterans were honored, and the evacuees from Karelia maintained their distinct cultural identity, keeping alive memories of the lands they had lost. International historical assessment of the Winter War has evolved over decades. Initial narratives focused on the David versus Goliath dynamic and Finnish heroism. Later analyses examined Soviet military failures and Stalin's strategic miscalculations. More recent scholarship has explored the war's complexity, including the difficult choices Finnish leaders faced, the genuine security concerns that motivated Soviet action, and the ways in which both sides adapted and learned throughout the conflict. The Winter War also influenced military thinking about winter warfare, more broadly. The lessons learned, particularly regarding equipment, clothing, tactics, and the importance of training for environmental conditions, was studied by militaries around the world. The United States military, preparing for potential operations in cold climates, examined Finnish tactics extensively. The concept of mobile defense using terrain to offset numerical inferiority became part of military doctrine in multiple countries. The evacuation of Karelia remains one of the war's most poignant legacies. 420,000 Finns left everything behind, taking only what they could carry, abandoning homes and farms that their families had occupied for generations. The Finnish government resettled these evacuees throughout the country, providing land and support to help them rebuild their lives. But the loss of Karelia never faded from Finnish consciousness. Even today, decades after the war, Karelian evacuees and their descendants maintain cultural organizations, preserve traditions, and remember the land they lost. The relationship between Finland and the Soviet Union, later Russia, was permanently shaped by the Winter War. Throughout the Cold War, Finland maintained a careful neutrality, avoiding direct confrontation with Soviet interests while preserving internal democracy and independence. This balancing act, sometimes called Finlandization, allowed Finland to survive as a free nation on the border of the Soviet Union. The memory of the Winter War, of what it cost to resist Soviet power, informed every Finnish strategic decision for the next 50 years. The Winter War's archival legacy is substantial. The Finnish National Archives house thousands of documents, photographs, and personal accounts from the war. Soviet archives, opened partially after the collapse of the Soviet Union, revealed previously unknown details about Soviet strategy and casualties. These archives continue to be studied by historians, seeking to understand not just the military aspects of the war, but also its human dimensions, the experiences of ordinary soldiers and civilians caught up in extraordinary events. The war's cultural impact extended beyond Finland. In literature, art, music, and film, the Winter War became a subject that captured imaginations worldwide. Finnish composer Jan Sibelius, though elderly during the war, saw his music adopted as an expression of Finnish national spirit. Artists created works depicting the frozen forests and desperate battles. Writers crafted novels and memoirs that attempted to capture the war's unique character. Each generation has reinterpreted the Winter War through the lens of its own concerns and understanding. For military historians, the Winter War remains a fascinating case study in asymmetric warfare, the challenges of combat in extreme environments, and the limits of material superiority. The conflict demonstrated that determination, tactical innovation, and understanding of terrain could partially offset vast disparities in numbers and equipment. It also showed the dangers of underestimating opponents and the importance of preparation for specific operational environments. These lessons remain relevant in an era when military operations continue to occur in harsh climates and difficult terrain. The personal stories from the Winter War, preserved in letters and diaries and memoirs, provide intimate glimpses into the human experience of the conflict. A Finnish soldier writing to his wife about missing their farm, describing the small details of home that he yearns to see again. A Soviet soldier's letter, expressing confusion about why they were fighting, carefully coded to avoid censorship, but still revealing doubt. A nurse's diary entry describing the arrival of wounded from a particularly terrible battle, her clinical descriptions unable to fully mask her emotional exhaustion. These individual voices, speaking across the decades, remind us that wars are ultimately experienced by human beings, one person at a time. The Winter War's conclusion in March 1940 brought relief mixed with bitterness. Finland had survived as an independent nation, but at tremendous cost. The territory ceded to the Soviet Union included some of Finland's most productive agricultural land and important industrial sites. The human toll, both dead and displaced, would affect Finnish society for generations. Yet there was also pride in what had been accomplished. Against all reasonable expectations, Finland had resisted one of the world's most powerful military forces for 3.5 months and had inflicted casualties far exceeding its own losses. In the decades following the war, as Finland rebuilt and modernized, the memory of the Winter War served multiple purposes. It was a source of national pride, proof that small nations could resist great powers. It was a warning about the costs of war and the importance of preparedness. It was a bond that united Finns across political and linguistic divides, a shared experience that defined national identity. Veterans of the war were honored, their sacrifice recognized and remembered. The lessons of the Winter War about the power of nature as a factor in warfare remain relevant. Climate and terrain are not merely backdrops to military operations, but active participants that can determine outcomes. Armies that fail to account for environmental conditions, that underestimate the challenges of extreme cold or difficult terrain, risk disaster regardless of their material advantages. This lesson, learned at such terrible cost in the Finnish forests, continues to inform military planning and doctrine. As the last veterans of the Winter War passed away, the responsibility for remembering fell to subsequent generations. Museums dedicated to the war preserve artifacts and tell stories. Memorial sites mark key battles and honor the fallen. Schools teach the war's history, ensuring that young Finns understand this crucial chapter in their nation's story. The archive, with its carefully preserved documents and photographs, serves as a bridge between past and present, allowing historians and ordinary citizens to connect with events that shaped modern Finland. The Winter War stands as a testament to human resilience, to the capacity of ordinary people to endure extraordinary hardship. In defense of home and freedom, it demonstrates the limits of military power when confronted with determined resistance, difficult terrain, and extreme environmental conditions. It reveals both the best and worst of human nature, courage and cruelty, sacrifice and suffering, hope and horror, all intermingled in the frozen forests of a small northern nation fighting for its survival. Closing reflection: the weight of winter, the preservation of memory. The archive room grows quieter now as evening deepens into night. Outside, the snow continues to fall, each flake adding to the accumulated white that blankets the ground, much as it did in that bitter winter of 1930 and 1940. The documents before us, the photographs with their frozen tableaus of war, the diary entries in fading ink, the technical drawings and medical reports, all these fragments of the past speak in whispers across the decades. What do we learn from these archives, from these careful records of suffering and survival? Perhaps most fundamentally, we learn that wars are not abstract things, not movements of colored arrows across maps or statistics in history books. Wars are experienced by individual human beings who feel cold and fear, who suffer and endure, who love and lose. The Winter War killed approximately 150,000 people, a number that becomes almost incomprehensible in its enormity. Yet each of those deaths was singular, the end of an individual life with its own hopes and memories and connections to others. We learn too about the power of environment. The Finnish winter was as much a participant in the war as any human army. It killed, it maimed, it shaped strategies and determined outcomes. The cold at -40 degrees did not distinguish between Soviet and Finnish soldiers, though Finns better understood how to survive it. Nature, indifferent to human conflicts, imposed its own logic on events, reminding us that for all our technology and organization, we remain vulnerable to the natural world's extremes. The archive teaches us about courage, not the Hollywood version of heroism, but the quiet courage of endurance. Finnish soldiers standing watch through the long Arctic night, knowing that the enemy outnumbered them 5-1. Soviet soldiers pushing forward despite terrible casualties, following orders even when those orders led to death. Civilians abandoning their homes with dignity, carrying what they could and walking into uncertain futures. Medical personnel working into exhaustion and then beyond it to save lives. This kind of courage, sustained over weeks and months, is perhaps harder than the momentary heroism of a charge into fire. But we also learn about the costs of war. Costs that cannot be measured only in casualties or lost territory. The psychological scars, the families torn apart, the communities destroyed, the futures that were never lived because young men died in frozen forests, these costs ripple forward through time, affecting generations. The evacuees from Karelia carried their loss throughout their lives, and their children and grandchildren inherited that loss, that knowledge of a homeland they never knew. War's true cost includes all these uncounted griefs. The meticulous documentation preserved in archives like this one serves a crucial purpose. It prevents forgetting. In an age of rapid change and short attention spans, archives anchor us to the past, insisting that we remember not just the broad outlines, but the details, the individual stories, the specific circumstances. They prevent history from becoming mythology, from being simplified into narratives that serve present purposes. As we close the folders and return the photographs to their protective sleeves, as we switch off the desk lamp and prepare to leave the archive room, we carry with us the weight of what we have learned. The Winter War was not just a military conflict between Finland and the Soviet Union. It was a crucible that tested human limits, a collision of armies and ideologies and environmental extremes that revealed fundamental truths about resilience and vulnerability, about the costs of freedom and the price of survival. The snow continues to fall outside, peaceful now, no longer carrying the threat of death. The forests of Finland, once battlegrounds, have long since returned to their quiet rhythms. The lakes where soldiers fought are now places where people swim in summer and fish through ice in winter. Life continues, as it always does, building over the scars of the past. But the archive remains. The documents wait, patient and silent, for those who would seek to understand. The photographs preserve faces that would otherwise be forgotten. The diaries give voice to the dead, and in this preservation, there is a kind of victory, a resistance against time's erosion of memory. Those who fought and suffered and died in the Winter War are gone, but their experiences, carefully documented and preserved, remain accessible to us, speaking across the years. If you found value in this journey through the archives, in this exploration of a war where winter itself became a weapon and a small nation held fast against impossible odds, please consider supporting this channel. Like this video, subscribe to the Long Winter Archive, and share this story with others who appreciate history told in depth, with attention to the details that bring the past to life. There are more archives to explore, more stories waiting to be told, more lessons from history that remain relevant to our present moment. The archive room door closes with a soft click. The snow falls. Memory persists. And somewhere in the darkness, the past whispers to those willing to listen, reminding us that we are connected to those who came before, that their struggles and sacrifices have shaped the world we inhabit, and that in remembering them, we honor not just their memory but our own humanity. Sleep well, knowing that these stories, these carefully preserved fragments of human experience, will be here when morning comes, waiting patiently for the next person who seeks to understand what happened in those frozen forests, in that brutal winter. When the world watched as Finland refused to surrender and winter fought alongside determination against overwhelming force, the lights go out, the archive rests, the story endures.